The Sahara Desert, 1941. The sun is a white-hot hammer, pounding against a landscape that looks less like a battlefield and more like the surface of the moon. There is no cover here. There are no trees. There are no walls. Just 2,000 miles of shifting, razor-sharp sand and a heat haze that turns the horizon into a shimmering lie. In this wasteland, the German Afrika Korps is a titan. Erwin Rommel's Panzers are the undisputed kings of the open sand, backed by the terrifying logistics of the Third Reich. To fight them, you would think you need a tank. You would think you need heavy armor, massive cannons, and the absolute peak of British industrial engineering. But as the dust settles over a remote Italian airfield, 500 miles behind the front lines, the guards don't see a tank. They don't see an armored column. They see a ghost. Or rather, a collection of ghosts. Out of the shimmering heat emerges a vehicle that looks like it belongs in a scrap heap, not a theater of war. It is high-riding, boxy, and completely open to the elements. It has no doors. It has no roof. It has no armor plating to speak of. It is draped in ragged camouflage netting, bristling with an absurd number of salvaged machine guns, and weighed down by so many fuel cans that it looks like a moving gas station. It is a Chevrolet WA-30 CWT truck, a civilian workhorse, a farm tool. It looks fragile. It looks slow. It looks like a relic that should have stayed on a paved road in a quiet suburb. It is a machine that, by every metric of modern warfare, should have been a death trap for the men inside it. And yet, this humble, unarmored truck was the weapon that broke the back of the Axis supply lines. This was the steel spine of the long-range desert group, the LRDG. While the great armies clashed in the north, these crude trucks were performing the impossible. They were navigating the Great Sand Sea, a place the Italian High Command thought was physically impassable for motorized vehicles. They were traveling distances that would make a modern logistics officer faint. They were the ships that allowed 6 men to wage a private war 500 miles behind enemy lines. This is the story of the machine that was too simple to fail, too tough to die, and too vital to ignore. In the early days of the Desert War, the British had a massive existential problem. The Sahara wasn't just a location. It was an ocean of land. If you followed the coast, you were in a meat grinder. But if you went south, into the deep desert, you were in a vacuum. The conventional military wisdom of the time said that no army could operate there. The heat would seize the engines. The sand would swallow the tires. The lack of water would kill the men within 48 hours. The British military establishment looked at the deep desert and saw a wall. They saw a boundary that protected Rommel's southern flank. But a man named Ralph Bagnold saw a highway. Bagnold was an explorer, a scientist who had spent the years between the wars obsessing over the physics of blown sand. He had spent his vacations driving old Fords into the deep desert just to see if he could survive. He knew that to win in Africa, you didn't need a faster tank. You needed a vehicle that could survive the empty quarter. The problem with tanks and armored cars was weight. In the desert, weight is a death sentence. A heavy vehicle sinks into the soft, fesh sand, a powder as fine as talcum that offers zero traction. Once you are belly deep in that dust, you are a sitting duck. You also need water. Tanks used water-cooled engines that thirsted for more than the crew did. Bagnold needed something different. He didn't want a weapon of war. He wanted a platform for survival. He needed a truck that was light enough to be dug out by hand, simple enough to be repaired with a hammer and a prayer, and reliable enough to carry 2 tons of supplies across 1,000 miles of nothingness. He settled on the Chevrolet, specifically the Canadian-built 1.5-ton 37WT. To the high command in Cairo, it looked like a joke. Sending unarmored trucks against the Panzers seemed like a waste of men. But the LRDG didn't want to fight the Panzers face to face. They wanted to be the shadow in the dark. The engineering of the LRDG Chevrolet was a masterclass in the philosophy of less is more. They took a standard civilian chassis and they stripped it to the bone. They threw away the roof. They threw away the doors. They even threw away the windshield. This wasn't for comfort, it was for survival. Glass reflects the sun. A single flash of sunlight off a windshield can be seen for 10 miles in the flat desert. Without a windshield, the driver had to endure a constant, agonizing sand blast to the face. But he stayed invisible. The lack of a cab also allowed the crew to bail out instantly if they were spotted by a Messerschmitt. In the desert, being trapped in a vehicle is how you die. They replaced the standard radiator with a specialized condenser. This was a simple brass tank connected to the radiator overflow. When the water boiled, which it did constantly in 120-degree heat, the steam would travel into the condenser, turn back into liquid, and be fed back into the engine. It was a closed loop that saved lives. In a place where a single gallon of water was worth its weight in gold, this humble pipe and tank system allowed the Chevrolets to run for weeks without needing a refill. It turned the engine into a self-sustaining organism. Then there were the tires. Standard military tires of the 1940s were narrow and high pressure, perfect for the mud of Europe, but useless in the Sahara. The LRDG used low-pressure sand tires. They were wide, soft, and looked almost flat. This increased the footprint of the truck, allowing it to float on top of the dunes rather than digging in. To an observer, the truck looked clumsy, wobbling over the sand on its balloon-like wheels. But while the heavy Italian armored cars were spinning their wheels into early graves, the Chevrolets were gliding. Under the hood was a 216 cubic inch stove-bolt six-cylinder engine. It wasn't powerful by modern standards. It wasn't fast. But it was incredibly torquey and remarkably simple. If a valve stuck or a gasket blew, a New Zealander mechanic could fix it in the middle of a sandstorm with basic hand tools and a bit of ingenuity. This was the unimpressive core of the machine. It didn't have the complexity of a German Maybach engine, and that was exactly why it won. Complexity is a liability when the nearest spare part is in Cairo, 3 weeks of hard driving away. The LRDG didn't just drive these trucks, they lived on them. Each truck was a self-contained ecosystem. They carried sand channels, long metal planks strapped to the sides. When a truck hit a soft patch and bogged down, the crew would jump out, shove the channels under the wheels, and drive out. They did this dozens of times a day. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing work in the midday sun. But it meant they could go where no one else could. They could cross the sand sea. They could traverse dunes the size of skyscrapers. They also turned these delivery trucks into the most heavily armed vehicles per ton in the entire war. Since they had no armor, their only defense was overwhelming, violent firepower. They scavenged, they stole, they improvised. A typical LRDG Chevy might mount a .50 caliber Browning machine gun for stopping light armor, a twin-mount Lewis gun for anti-aircraft defense, and perhaps a Vickers K machine gun, originally meant for aircraft, for a blistering rate of fire during an ambush. Some even carried a 37mm anti-tank gun bolted into the rear bed. They were essentially small, fast-moving gunboats on a sea of sand. Picture the scene. An Italian colonial outpost, deep in the Libyan interior. The soldiers there feel safe. They are hundreds of miles from the front. They think the desert behind them is a wall. Suddenly, out of the pitch-black darkness, 3 of these unimpressive trucks roar into the compound. They aren't just shooting, they are unleashing a wall of lead from every direction. The LRDG would circle the camp like modern-day pirates, their Chevrolets bouncing over the rugged ground, their crews firing from a standing position in the open cabs. Within minutes, the fuel dumps are on fire, the planes are riddled with holes, and the trucks are gone, disappearing back into the dunes before the enemy can even find their boots. But the real war wasn't always fought with bullets. The road watch was perhaps their most vital and least cinematic mission. For weeks at a time, 2 trucks would hide in the scrub near the Via Balbia, the main coastal highway, the only road Rommel could use to supply his army. The crews would sit in the blistering heat, documenting every single tank, every truck, and every soldier that passed. They were the eyes of the British High Command. Because the Chevrolet was so low profile and could be easily camouflaged with a few nets and some desert scrub, they remained undetected just yards away from the German army. This unimpressive truck allowed 6 men to provide the intelligence that eventually led to the victory at El Alamein. They knew what Rommel had before he even knew he had it. When you compare the LRDG Chevrolet to its counterparts, the genius of the design becomes clear. The Germans had the SDK-FZ 231, a massive 8-wheeled armored car. It was a marvel of engineering, sophisticated, fast, and protected by steel plate. On a paved road, it was superior in every way. But in the deep desert, it was a nightmare. It was too heavy. Its complex suspension hated the sand. It required a massive logistical tail to keep it running. If an SDK-FZ 231 broke down in the dunes, it was gone. The Chevrolet, meanwhile, was the AK-47 of vehicles. It was cheap, it was light, and it just kept going. It didn't matter if it looked crude. It mattered that it reached the destination. The LRDG trucks traveled an average of 1,500 miles between services. They operated in temperatures that would melt the soles of a man's boots. They carried loads that were 50 over their rated capacity. They weren't just good enough. They were the only machines capable of the task. They proved that in the harshest environments on Earth, the most advanced technology is often the first to fail. The desert doesn't care about your engineering degree. It cares about whether your radiator can hold pressure and whether your tires can find a grip. The legacy of the LRDG truck is seen today in every Special Forces vehicle in the world. Look at the modern Technical, the Toyota Hilux with a machine gun in the back. Look at the U.S. Special Forces ground mobility vehicle. They all follow the blueprint laid down by Bagnold and his Chevrolets. High mobility, open air for situational awareness, massive fuel capacity, and overwhelming firepower. They realize that armor is a cage. In the desert, speed and invisibility are your only true shields. If you are being shot at, you have already failed your mission. The truck was designed to ensure you were never seen in the first place. By the end of the North African campaign, the LRDG had destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than the Royal Air Force had in the air. They had mapped thousands of miles of uncharted territory that was previously a blank space on the map. They had rescued downed pilots, kidnapped high-ranking generals, and sowed such a sense of paranoia that Rommel had to divert thousands of troops just to guard his rear areas. And they did it all in a truck that was originally designed to haul grain in Saskatchewan or milk in Auckland. There is a lesson in the dusty, oil-stained silhouette of the LRDG Chevrolet. We live in a world that worships the high-tech. We want the stealth fighter, the AI-driven drone, the complex solution to every problem. We think that more features mean more capability. But history tells us a different story. History tells us that when the world is at its harshest, when the stakes are at their highest, and when you are 500 miles from help, complexity is your enemy. Complexity is a point of failure. The LRDG truck was a contradiction. It was a civilian machine in a total war. It was an unarmored target in a world of steel and fire. But it succeeded because it didn't try to fight the desert. It cooperated with it. It was built on the philosophy that reliability is the ultimate weapon. It reminds us that the most important tool isn't the one with the most features. It's the one that works when everything else is broken. In the end, it wasn't the Panzers that owned the Sahara. It was a group of bearded men in battered trucks, proving that with enough grit, a few machine guns, and a reliable engine, you can conquer the world. They took the unimpressive and made it legendary. They took the crude and made it critical. And in doing so, they changed the course of the war, 1 mile of sand at a time. Imagine the sheer audacity of it. You are sitting in a truck with no doors, driving across a landscape that wants to kill you, heading toward an enemy that outguns you 1,000 to 1. Your only navigation is a sun compass, a simple shadow on a dial, and your only hope is that the Chevrolet Stovebolt engine doesn't miss a beat. This wasn't just warfare. It was a feat of endurance that pushed human and machine to the absolute limit. Every time a modern special operator climbs into a stripped-down vehicle to disappear into the night, they are riding in the shadow of the LRDG. They are using the lessons learned by men who realized that a windshield was a liability and that a brass water tank was more valuable than a cannon. The crude British truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a philosophy of war. It was the realization that in the face of overwhelming force, the simple, the reliable, and the persistent will always find a way. The desert has reclaimed most of the tracks left by the LRDG. The wind has smoothed over the dunes where they fought and bled. But the story of the Chevrolet 30CWT remains. It stands as a testament to the idea that you don't need the most expensive machine to win. You just need the right one. You need the machine that refuses to quit. You need the machine that looks like a failure but performs like a miracle. That is the true power of the long-range desert group. And that is why this unimpressive truck remains one of the most important machines ever to go to war. The next time you see something that looks outdated, or something that looks too simple for the modern world, remember the LRDG. Remember the men who took a farm truck and used it to dismantle an empire. Because in the heat of the battle, and in the silence of the deep desert, it isn't the flashy or the complex that survives. It's the simple. It's the rugged. It's the machine that, despite everything, just keeps moving forward. And that, more than any armor or any gun, is what wins wars. Think about the men who drove them. They were called the bearded brigands. They didn't look like soldiers. They wore sandals, sheepskin coats, and Arab headdresses. They looked like they belonged to the sand. And their trucks reflected them. They were scarred, they were dusty, and they were incredibly effective. They carried everything they needed to survive for a month. 100 gallons of fuel, 50 gallons of water, boxes of rations, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They were mobile fortresses without walls. When the war moved to Europe, the LRDG tried to take their Chevrolets with them, but the trucks didn't fit the mountains of Italy or the forests of Greece. They were creatures of the open space. They were specialized tools for a specialized world. They were retired, left to rust in the sands they had conquered. But their spirit didn't die. It moved into the jeeps of the SAS. It moved into the Land Rovers of the Cold War. It moved into the very DNA of how we think about special operations. The LRDG Chevrolet taught us that the horizon isn't a limit, it's a challenge. It taught us that impassable is just a lack of imagination. And most importantly, it taught us that the most unimpressive-looking tool in the shed might just be the one that saves your life. It wasn't the truck Rommel expected, but it was the truck that defeated him. Simple, crude, effective. A masterpiece of survival in a world of destruction. As the sun sets over the Sahara today, the wind still whistles through the rusted frames of the few Chevrolets that were left behind. They are silent now. The stove-bolt engines are cold, The machine guns are gone. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the roar of the exhaust and the crunch of the sand channels. You can almost see the ghosts of the LRDG heading south into the empty quarter, proving once and for all that in the theater of war, the most important machine is the one that gets you home. The story of the LRDG truck is a reminder that we should never judge a machine by its exterior. A tank is a statement of power, but a truck is a statement of intent. The power of the LRDG wasn't in their ability to destroy, but in their ability to endure. They outlasted, outnavigated, and outthought an enemy that was technically superior in every way. And they did it with a vehicle that started its life as a civilian delivery van. That is the ultimate triumph of the practical over the theatrical. That is the legacy of the crude British desert truck. In the final analysis, the LRDG Chevrolet wasn't just a part of the war. It was the reason the war in the desert was won. It turned the geography of North Africa against the Axis. It turned the very sand into a weapon. It proved that in the hands of the right men, even the most unimpressive machine can become a legend. It was, and remains, the greatest bad idea in the history of military engineering. And the world is a different place because of it. So the next time you see a high-tech marvel, ask yourself, can it survive the sand sea? Can it run on boiling water? Can it be fixed with a hammer in a sandstorm? If the answer is no, then it might not be as advanced as you think. Because the LRDG Chevrolet could do all of that and more. It was the king of the desert, not because it was strong, but because it was right. It was the simple machine for a complex world. And that is a lesson we should never forget. The mission is over. The trucks have returned to base. The dust has settled. But the lesson of the LRDG remains as clear as a desert night. Simplicity is not the absence of sophistication. It is the ultimate form of it. Reliability is not a feature. It is a necessity. And the most unimpressive machine in the fleet might just be the one that makes history. This was the truck that let 6 men wage war 500 miles behind enemy lines. This was the steel heart of the long-range desert group. This was the machine that won the desert.